October 1985. I stepped off the bus in Charleston, South Carolina, after 4 decades away from the place I once called home. I was carrying nothing but a weathered suitcase, a heart scorched by war, and a yellowed envelope with an address written in a woman's delicate cursive, a hand I hadn't seen since 1944. Her name was Helen. She'd written to me just once, in the winter of 1945. A letter I never received. A letter that, like so many other pieces of that war, got lost somewhere between battlefields and bunkers. But I held it now, crumpled, creased, the ink slightly faded, but every word burning like it had just been written. And it was that letter, discovered recently in the belongings of a fallen comrade, that pulled me back here 40 years later. I didn't know if she was still alive. I didn't know if she remembered me or if she'd want to, but something in me refused to let it rest. You see, for the rest of the world, the war had ended. Parades, medals, newspaper headlines, a country that moved on. But not for me. Not when every night I'd close my eyes and see her smile. That last moment in the schoolyard when she handed me a folded napkin with her initials and kissed me on the cheek just before I shipped out to Europe in a borrowed uniform. The city had changed. Charleston wasn't rubble and ration books anymore. There were tourists now, and souvenir shops and coffee houses with jazz spilling out the windows. The houses were brighter, the sidewalks cleaner, but nothing felt familiar. I was a ghost walking through someone else's hometown. I walked into an old bakery I thought might still be family-run and asked the woman behind the counter if she remembered a girl named Helen Murphy. I showed her the letter, carefully like it was a relic from another lifetime. She stared at it for a moment, then squinted at me and said slowly, "Try the corner of Willow and 8th. She used to live there, but don't be surprised if she doesn't recognize you." I walked the 2 blocks with the letter in my chest pocket like a compass. Number 214, a small white house with green shutters. Flowers on the porch. I rang the doorbell. My hands were shaking, from fear, from age, from everything that had been unsaid for 4 decades. The door creaked open. An elderly woman stood there. Not Helen, not the girl from my memory. I was about to apologize, tell her I had the wrong house, maybe even the wrong decade. But then she smiled, and in that one small moment, time collapsed in on itself, because it was her. That smile, that same smile from the schoolyard in 1944, the smile I'd been chasing in every dream for 40 years. If this story is touching you the way it touched me to write it, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. Charleston wasn't the place I remembered. It had the same name, the same narrow streets lined with moss-draped oaks, and the scent of salt and sun-warmed brick. But the Charleston I knew had been quieter, dustier, its heart still stitched together by the war and its silences. Now, it pulsed with life. Tourists snapped photos of pastel houses. Joggers passed me with headphones on. Kids on bikes rode past, not knowing that just a few blocks away, I once kissed a girl goodbye before boarding a train that would carry me toward the trenches of Europe. I walked like a man out of time, not looking for landmarks, but for ghosts. I hadn't planned what I'd say when I found her. Would she even believe me? Would she even want to? I stopped in front of Murphy's Bakery, still standing after all these years. The gold letters on the window were faded, but the bell above the door gave the same soft chime I remembered from Saturday mornings when we'd split a cherry Danish and talk about what we'd do after the war. Inside, an elderly woman in a blue apron looked up as I walked in. I took the letter from my coat pocket and placed it gently on the counter like it was something holy. "I'm looking for Helen Murphy," I said. She stared at the envelope, her brow furrowed, then glanced up at me like she was searching a photo in her mind. "I haven't seen her in years," she said after a pause. "But try Willow and 8th, white house with green shutters. She used to live there, might still." I walked slower than I needed to. My heart didn't race. It stumbled. There's a kind of fear that doesn't scream. It just settles in your bones like a chill you can't shake. 214 Willow Street. The porch swing creaked in the wind. A hummingbird hovered near a hanging plant. I stared at the door for a full minute before I rang the bell. The woman who answered wasn't her, or rather wasn't the version of her I'd carried all these years. This woman had silver hair, lines around her eyes, and hands that spoke of decades of holding, washing, waiting. I opened my mouth to apologize, but then she smiled. And suddenly I was 18 again, standing in that schoolyard in my too big army jacket, trying not to cry, as she gave me a pressed flower and said, "Come back safe." It was her. That smile didn't change. It had lived in my memories so vividly that I sometimes doubted it was real, but there it was, soft, familiar, unmistakable. She didn't ask my name. She didn't need to. "Victor." "Ah," she whispered. I nodded, couldn't speak. My throat was full of 40 years. She stepped aside and I walked in. Her home was filled with light. Bookshelves crowded with old novels and faded photos, the scent of lavender and something baking. It felt lived in, like her life had been full, like the world had moved on even if I hadn't. We sat down in the living room, surrounded by pictures of people I didn't know. Children, grandchildren, a husband perhaps. But at that moment, it was just us. Two people who had once shared a moment before history tore it in half. She told me she'd moved back to Charleston in the 60s after raising her daughter up north. Said she still walked past the old high school from time to time, wondered if the bricks remembered us the way we remembered them. I told her about the war, about the mountains in Italy, the snow in Belgium, the days I went weeks without hearing English, and how years later a friend cleaning out the belongings of our old commanding officer found the letter she'd written me, unopened, unread, untouched, until now. She closed her eyes when I said that. "I wrote so many," she said. "I never knew if they reached you, but I kept writing." I told her I'd written 2 letters I never sent. Letters I buried under my cot, tucked into my helmet, burned when the pain got too heavy. "Some nights," she said, "I'd fall asleep with your name in my mouth, just to feel like you were still in the world somewhere." We didn't cry right away. Not yet. We just sat in the middle of time, letting it wash over us like ocean tide, cold, relentless, but strangely gentle. Sometimes finding someone you lost isn't about going back. It's about standing still, letting the years fall away, and seeing what remains. And for us, it was the smile, the same smile from 1944, the one that told me, even after everything, I'd come home. There we were, sitting in her living room, 2 people shaped by war and silence, with the years folded between us like layers of dust on an old photograph. And yet, in that quiet moment, it felt as though we had simply paused rather than vanished, like time had only taken a breath before allowing us to meet again. She said my name, Victor, not like a question, not even with surprise, but as if she had said it countless times in her mind over the years. Like it had never really left her mouth, just waited patiently to be spoken aloud again. And I, still speechless, simply nodded because the flood rising in my chest didn't leave space for words. "I always thought you died," she whispered, her voice soft but unwavering, and I watched her eyes scan my face, as if searching for the boy I once was beneath the grey in my hair and the lines around my eyes. And I wanted to tell her everything in that moment, how I had nearly died, how I had disappeared not by choice, but by chaos, how a letter tucked into the pocket of a dead officer had become me the only reason I ever made it back. But all I could do was sit there, trembling, overwhelmed not by the past we'd lost, but by the present we'd been given. She stood slowly and disappeared down the hall, returning moments later with a small wooden box, the kind that holds keepsakes too sacred to be kept loose. And from it, she took out a stack of letters, tied with faded blue ribbon, and when she placed them in my lap, my hands shook before I even untied the knot. "I wrote these to you," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "One every month for almost 2 years. I didn't know where to send them after the last one came back marked undeliverable. But I couldn't stop. As I held those letters, unopened, unread, but somehow still alive, something inside me cracked open. something I had kept sealed for decades because while the war took many things from me, it was her absence that haunted me most. And now, here she was, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a woman who had waited in her own way, quietly, faithfully, stubbornly. I told her about the front lines, about the frostbitten nights in the Ardennes, the endless echo of artillery in my skull, the faces of men who stopped being boys in seconds. And I told her that every time I wanted to give up, every time the weight of grief and fatigue threatened to push me over the edge, I would close my eyes and see her in that schoolyard, holding my hand with both of hers, telling me to come back home. "I never forgot you," I said finally, and the words didn't sound dramatic or rehearsed. They just came out the way truths do when there's nothing left to lose. She looked down at her lap, nodded slowly and said, "Neither did I." And then she told me her part of the story, how she had waited at the train station for weeks after the war ended, hoping I might appear, how she'd asked around at the local VA hospital, how she'd even written to the Red Cross, hoping someone, somewhere, had seen my name on a list, in a file, on a dog tag, and how eventually the world gently pressed her forward as it always does, whispering that life had to go on, that perhaps some things were meant to stay unfinished. "I got married in 1952, she said, as if confessing something she wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "He was a good man, kind, patient. He knew about you." I smiled, though it hurt, and said nothing, because there was nothing to forgive and everything to understand. She showed me a photo, a black and white picture of a man with strong eyes and a warm smile, holding a baby girl, her daughter, and later, her grandchildren, their faces lit with joy and innocence, playing in the very yard where we now sat under the dappled shade of the old oak tree that had stood guard since long before we knew what war or heartbreak meant. "I built a life," she said, "but there was always a space where you would have been." I wanted to say I understood, that I too had built something out of the wreckage, even if it wasn't a life in the traditional sense, that I had returned from Europe broken in places doctors couldn't see, that I had drifted from job to job, state to state, never marrying, never settling, because part of me was always waiting, not for her exactly, but for that moment, this moment, when the sea, Urgel, might finally close. "I never really loved another woman," I told her. "Not the way I loved you, not even close." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward, took my hand, and held it in both of hers, just like she had on that train platform so many years ago. And in that moment, there were no wars, no letters, no lost decades, just the warmth of skin on skin and the quiet knowledge that love, real love, doesn't vanish. It waits. Somewhere between memory and presence, pain and peace, we found each other again, not as the young lovers we once were, but as the people we became, shaped by the years, softened by time, and held together not by what we had, but by what we never let go. She led me down the narrow hallway of her home, her steps slow but steady, and opened the door to a room that felt like stepping into the very heart of a life well lived. There were framed photographs along the walls, the kind that told stories without needing captions, and the scent of old paper and dried flowers hung in the air like the soft echo of memory. "This is where I keep the pieces," she said almost apologetically, as if preserving a lifetime of family and love and loss was somehow something to be embarrassed by, and I followed her in with the quiet reverence of someone entering a chapel. On the bookshelf stood a wedding photo, her in a simple white dress holding a bouquet of daisies, and beside her, a man with kind eyes and a nervous smile, the kind of man who probably held her hand gently, who probably spoke softly, who probably never asked questions he didn't want to know the answers to. "He passed away 10 years ago," she said, almost absently, as if the words still surprised her when spoken aloud. "He was a good man. He gave me everything he had, and I think in his own way, he always knew there was a part of me that belonged to someone else." I didn't speak. I couldn't. Because in that moment, All I could do was stare at that photo and feel the strange ache of being both grateful and heartbroken. Grateful that someone had cared for her when I couldn't, and heartbroken that I had only just now returned, too late for everything but this. She showed me pictures of her daughter, a woman now, grown, with her mother's strong cheekbones and warm smile, and then photos of grandchildren, a boy playing catch in the backyard, a little girl blowing out birthday candles in a cake-shaped tiara, moments that had passed without me, lives that had blossomed while I drifted through mine in silence. "I thought about you, Victor," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "Not every day, not always, but enough, especially in the winters, when the world would get quiet and I'd hear that song playing, the one they played at the dance the night before you left." I knew exactly which one she meant, I could still hear it too, in my own memory. The way the record had crackled, the way her hand had fit in mine, the way I had memorized her face under the soft gymnasium lights, not knowing if I'd ever see it again. She sat down on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. "I used to wonder," she said, "if you ever thought of me, if I'd imagined it all, if maybe we were just two teenagers clinging to something impossible, but I never really stopped hoping, not completely." And I told her everything. I told her about the explosion in Italy, about the blood and the fire, and the way time stretched into a haze of pain and darkness, about waking up in a makeshift hospital where no one knew my name, about being listed as missing for months before being transferred, paperwork lost, identity shuffled through a bureaucracy that cared more about numbers than names. I told her about the scar on my shoulder, the one I still touched in the cold, the one that reminded me that I was never supposed to have survived, and how, in that moment of near death, what kept me tethered to life wasn't duty, or country, or even family. It was her name spoken softly in my mind like a prayer I didn't know I believed in. She didn't cry, not right away. She just listened, holding her own wrist like she needed to ground herself in something real. And then I told her the hardest truth of all, that I never truly loved another woman. That I had tried, yes, gone on dates, made friends, shared apartments, even danced once or twice with someone who smiled a little like she did. But it had never lasted because no matter how much time passed, no matter how many faces I saw, they all dissolved the moment I remembered hers. She looked at me then, really looked. And there was no anger, no bitterness, only something deeper, heavier, sadder. "I waited too," she said, "until I couldn't anymore." Her voice didn't tremble, but her hand did, as she reached for a drawer in the nightstand and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. It was a pressed flower, brittle and delicate, sealed inside a small envelope. "You gave me this," she whispered. "At the station, I kept it all these years." My heart clenched. That flower, once bright, now faded, was proof that memory isn't something you store in your mind. It's something you carry in your chest, quietly, for a lifetime. We talked until the light changed, until the sun dipped low and cast golden streaks across the floor. And with every story we shared, every silence we allowed, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, one I hadn't realized I'd been carrying all my life. Because she had lived a full life, and I had only survived. And yet here we were, two people, still tethered by something invisible and indestructible, something that time could not erase, even if it had stolen nearly everything else. Somewhere between what was lost and what was left, we found the thing that still connected us. It wasn't youth, it wasn't regret. It was love, quiet, steady, unspoken, but never, ever gone. We ended the day sitting beneath the old oak tree in her backyard, the same tree she said her father had planted when she was a little girl, the same tree that had seen her fall in love, raise a family, and now, somehow, witness a reunion neither of us ever truly believed could happen. The late afternoon light filtered through its leaves like golden silk, casting shadows on the grass that moved gently with the wind. And there was something sacred about that moment, something that made the air feel softer, quieter, like the world had finally remembered how to breathe. She had brought out 2 glasses of sweet tea, The way she used to like it, she said, extra sugar, extra lemon. And we sat there in the stillness, listening to the rustle of the branches, the chirp of a lone cricket that had come out too early, and the distant laugh of a child from across the street, a sound so pure and far removed from everything we'd endured that it felt like a song from a Tim. That had never been broken. I pulled the envelope from my coat, not the one she had written to me, but one I had written to her, dated 1946. I had written it during my recovery in the hospital in Germany, when my body had stopped screaming long enough for my hands to hold a pencil again, when the only thing more painful than the bandages was the silence I knew had swallowed our story whole. And yet, I had written it, every word of it, knowing there was no address, no way to send it, no reason other than hope. I handed it to her without a word. She looked at it for a long moment before opening it, unfolding the paper slowly, carefully, as if the years pressed into its fibers might disintegrate if she moved too quickly. And then she began to read. Her lips moved silently. Her eyes scanned every line, and I watched the weight of each sentence settle over her shoulders, the way only a letter written by a version of someone you once loved, and still do, can. When she finished, she folded it back neatly, held it to her chest, and looked away for a moment, blinking toward the tree. "You wrote this without knowing if I was even alive," she said. "I wrote it because I needed to," I answered, "because if I didn't, the part of me that still believed in you would have disappeared." She didn't cry. Neither did I. We'd already done that. We had cried in different decades, in different cities, on different nights when the weight of what could have been was too much to carry alone. This wasn't about tears anymore. This was about presence, about what remained after the storm. "You know," she said, her voice steady, "I waited too, for a while, for years maybe, but life isn't made for waiting, not forever. Eventually you start telling yourself the story differently. You start pretending it was never that serious, that it wasn't real, just a sweet chapter from a time you barely remember. But that's a lie, isn't it? It was real," I said, "more real than anything after it." She turned to me then, and for the first time in hours, she took my hand, not with politeness, not out of habit, but like someone who had finally found the missing part of a sentence that had been unfinished for too long. "I think," she said, "we don't always get the life we planned, but sometimes, if we're lucky, we get a moment of truth, one moment that makes sense of all the pain." And somehow, I understood her. Not just the words, but the silence around them. Because what we were doing wasn't closure. It wasn't some romantic movie ending with violins and declarations. It was deeper than that. It was peace. Quiet, honest, necessary peace. We sat like that until the shadows stretched longer and the evening air turned cool. She brought out a light sweater and draped it over my shoulders, laughing that I still forgot to dress for the southern chill after sunset. And I realized then that laughter hadn't sounded in my ears like that in years. Warm, familiar, forgiving. We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing left to ask, no unfinished business, no regrets that needed to be spoken aloud. We simply were. She walked me to the gate later, just as the first stars began to blink into the navy blue sky, and when I turned to look back, she was standing on the porch with both hands wrapped around her cup, the porch light casting a halo around her white hair, her eyes calm, and on her face that same smile. Not a smile of longing or sadness or even relief, but of recognition. The smile you give someone who knows the deepest part of your story and chooses to remember it with grace. And as I walked down that sidewalk, step by step, into a night that somehow didn't feel quite so lonely, I understood something I never had before, that love doesn't always ask for a future. Sometimes it just asks to be remembered, fully, gently, truthfully. We had spoken the impossible. We had survived the unimaginable, and in doing so, we found something more precious than all the years we'd lost. We found a stillness in each other that asked for nothing, needed no promises, and held no bitterness, only peace. And that, at last, was enough. I didn't ask to stay, and she didn't ask me to leave. There was no need. Some goodbyes don't require words, and some reunions don't need to last forever to be complete. We both knew that what we had found wasn't meant to be extended, just honored, held with tenderness, and then gently let go. When I stepped outside that final time, the night air was cooler than I remembered. The porch light glowed softly behind her, casting long shadows across the yard we once imagined a future in. She stood there, both hands resting lightly on the railing, watching me walk away, and when I turned around for one last glance, she was still there, still smiling. That same smile, my God, that smile. I didn't feel sorrow, not this time. I felt whole. Because sometimes the heart isn't looking for a second chance, just an ending that finally makes sense. I spent a few more days in Charleston, wandering its streets like a man relearning how to exist, not in memory, but in the moment. I sat by the harbor, watched the boats drift by, listened to the wind brushing through Spanish moss, and allowed myself to simply be, not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as a man who had been lost for a very long time, and for one brief, beautiful afternoon had been found. I didn't visit her again. I didn't need to. That moment under the oak tree, her hand in mine, that letter between us, the shared silence, it was more than a reunion. It was a return to something sacred, something we'd both carried quietly, each in our own way, never expecting the chance to breathe life back into it. And now, years later, I sit at my desk writing this letter to you, my grandson, who carries my name and my stubborn heart. I want you to know this story, not because it's tragic, but because it's true. Because sometimes, life doesn't offer answers when you want them, but it will give you meaning when you're finally ready to understand. So if one day you find yourself holding a yellowed envelope, or a photo with a name scribbled on the back, or even just a feeling you can't quite explain, follow it, even if it leads you to a place that feels foreign or a door you think might be the wrong one. Because sometimes the only way to find what your heart has never forgotten is to knock, and if you're lucky, if you're really lucky, someone might open the door and smile. We post new stories every day, real stories that move, heal, and inspire.